The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
I think that there is definite need to reevaluate defamation laws and who they are actually protecting in the Canadian context, and specifically in media, as well as those who make formal reports.
After the rise of the Me Too movement, activists noticed an increase in a new tool to fight against allegations of sexual assault. Many men accused of misconduct have turned to defamation lawsuits to protect their career and reputation. Does Canadian law make it too easy for men to sue their accusers? Is this the new avenue to litigate sexual assault cases? Mandi Gray explores these questions in her new book, Suing for Silence: Sexual Violence and Defamation Law. And she joins us in our studio. Welcome.
Hi.
All right, so let's get into how you got started. How did you get interested in the specific intersection of sexual assault and defamation law?
So it started around 2017 when I was doing a lot of public-facing work in regards to sexual assault specifically. And I was hearing from people globally about their experiences of reporting or trying to report and not being able to, all the things that we heard really during the Me Too movement. And one of these stories really was shocking to me, and it was Lynn, who you meet in the first chapter of the book. And Lynn was apprenticing as a tattoo artist in France. She's Canadian, and while she was there, she experienced repeated bullying and harassment and eventually repeated rapes by her boss. And she reported it to the police in France, and he was criminally charged. And after the criminal charges were laid, there was a trial, and he was acquitted. And following the acquittal in France at the time, he was able to criminally charge her for making false accusations, so she was facing jail time, and also sue her in defamation. And as you can imagine, this was really shocking to Lynn, who was already back in Canada, who then had to go to France and defend herself against potential jail time and a defamation suit in French, which was her second language. And it really had a detrimental impact on her well-being, even after the charges against her had been dropped and the lawsuit had ended. However, I assumed that this was something happening in France. It was happening elsewhere until shortly after I met another woman who had a similar experience, but this was in Canada, and she had reported somebody in her workplace for sexual harassment and similarly was sued. And so I asked Joanna Birnbaum, who's a litigator in Toronto who specializes in sexual abuse cases at the time, and she was representing a number of women who had also been sued after making formal reports of sexual assault. And then the Me Too movement happened, and I don't need to give you a primer on what that entailed, but it resulted in many people feeling empowered to speak about what happened to them, to make formal reports, and as you mentioned, resulted in a whole slew of defamation lawsuits. And that's really what we're seeing in the courts right now being litigated, and has become a more common tactic following disclosure or report of sexual assault in the Canadian context, but also globally.
All right, before we dive into that, I do want to ask, which I find quite interesting, on the day you submitted the proposal for this project, the book, the subject matter got personal for you. Do you mind telling us what happened there?
Yeah, it was one of those really unfortunate set of circumstances. So this book is from my PhD work, and part of that process is submitting a proposal about what you're going to do. And I was on that high of getting into my research, and I sat down in class and I opened my email and saw, hey, have you read the National Post? You're being sued for defamation. And I was not being sued by the person who assaulted me, but I was being sued by somebody who was publicly accused of sexual assault. And I tweeted about the case when many people were engaging in a public conversation about the allegations that were made to the university at the time. So it was shocking to me. And despite, finishing my PhD, doing a 2-year postdoc, writing this book, becoming a faculty member. 6 years have gone by, and my case is still before the courts.
Wow.
So just in terms of like the longevity and the consequences, it is quite severe, and really did, I think, I didn't want to focus the book specifically on my own experience, but I am upfront that I do also have this personal experience of being a defendant in a defamation lawsuit, which I think maybe helped people feel comfortable talking to me, because I knew just how high the stakes were and the challenges of defending yourself in defamation.
Fair enough. All right. You describe Canadian defamation law as being plaintiff-friendly. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. So those weren't my words, but defamation law in Canada looks different because a plaintiff can initiate a defamation suit, and then it's on the defendant being the person being sued, to defend those statements. And so that's very different in other cases of law where it would be the plaintiff has to put forward the case and make the argument, whereas the onus falls specifically on the person being sued to defend their statements and validate why they made those statements. And that can be particularly challenging in cases of sexual assault, given all the discriminatory myths and challenges of reporting that have all been really well documented in the last decade in Canada specifically.
We talked about, the Me Too movement, but you write that litigation has the ability to push sexual violence discourse from the public sphere. Why do lawsuits or threats of lawsuits stifle this conversation? What is it when someone gets served?
So, really sound legal advice. Any good lawyer will tell you, stop talking about it. And what that does, and if you can look at my case, for example, 6 years goes by and you can't talk about it. There was somebody, for example, who in the book was sued by an organization for speaking about sexual violence. And although they withdrew the lawsuit the eve of going to trial, that was 5 years that she wasn't speaking about. It was a physician who was sexually assaulting patients. So it takes these discussions, really important discussions, out of media who might be maybe risk averse to publish these kinds of stories when you have a litigious person. But also I argue that even beyond the public sphere, there's lawsuits for people disclosing to family members and in these private settings. And what we know about sexual harm is it's really critical that you can have these open conversations about what happened to you. So I really do worry that if these lawsuits are to continue, especially in these private settings, especially when people are making formal reports, how can we continue to encourage people to take these steps with the possibility that they could be sued in defamation?
I want to pick up on the point you made about the media, because I want to know, what does fear of litigation do to people like us? And what I mean by that is people who are writing books or talking about current events in the media. Because as you mentioned in your book, pre-Me Too, there was the ability in media to offer some anonymity. And we see that post-Me Too, that in terms of media, that option isn't necessarily there as much. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, from my conversations with people who wanted to go to media in a post-Me Too context, there were, like you said, a lot fewer opportunities to do so anonymously. And it's really from this liability or concern about having anonymous accusers. For example, men initiating defamation actions to get the names, and it creates an additional challenge, I think, and especially within the climate of news media right now and being a bit more risk averse. And I write about freelance authors, for example, who maybe don't have the same access to in-house counsel or an insurance policy that will cover them if they get sued in defamation. So I did notice that there were a chilling effect on the types of stories that are being reported, and I even write about this in the book. As much as I critique media, I also did the same things I criticize in terms of not having the full details of what happened, or what some of the people would call watering down allegations, removal of names, and it becomes a lot more sanitized. But it was also of my own fear of being sued in defamation for this book. So it is a definite challenge, and I think that there is definite need to reevaluate defamation laws and who they are actually protecting in the Canadian context, and specifically in media, as well as those who make formal reports.
Well, let's talk about that one. I want to talk about more of the gender binary in that. Chapter 3 of your book is called The Gender of Reputation. You write that defamation law has different consequences for men and women in Canada, obviously looking at it from a historical stance as well. Why is that?
So I thought this was kind of the most, the most interesting part of the research process for me was seeing the kind of what I call the gender underpinnings of defamation law and why defamation law was even created. And it was created at a time when there was a desire to encourage civil society so men would rely less on bloody duels. Right. So if you put it in that context of why it was created, it was really to encourage public discourse instead of relying on violence. And so historically, men would typically sue for dishonor to their reputation that would result in like damages to their ability to make money. Whereas when women sued historically, it was primarily in relation to their ability to marry and was often intertwined with commentary about their sexuality. Mm-hmm. So it was very much gendered historically and continues to be so in terms of like how we value men's reputation versus women's reputation. And I thought that was a really critical piece in this book because so much focus was on the reputational damage experienced by the men who've been accused of sexual assault. And even myself, as I was doing this research, it took me a while to realize the reputational damage that is experienced by people who report or disclose sexual assault and then are sued. And there were really profound professional consequences for a lot of these people who either spoke up directly or were supporting somebody in reporting.
I do have to ask this question. What about when a man accused of sexual violence is innocent? Wouldn't a defamation suit be an important tool to restore that reputation?
I think that's such a critical question, and I think it's really important because what we're seeing is so much focus on the false accusations and that there's this societal problem of false reporting when the statistics really show us otherwise. False reporting is a very small percentage. What we know about gendered violence, however, it impacts a lot of people, and we have a systemic problem, declared epidemic levels of gendered violence. And so constantly worrying about the false accusations at the expense of encouraging reporting and disclosure, I think, is problematic at its core. But I do think there needs to be avenues when false reports are made, but false reporting is not happening at the frequency in which these defamation lawsuits are being initiated and actioned.
All right, I want to talk about sort of the negative effects that you heard from the women that you interviewed who were sued, because it's not just the emotional, there's also physical. Tell me a little bit about that.
The consequences were so complex. So we talked about, the silencing impact, and that really had an impact on the individual in terms of access to counseling, access to resources, fear of talking about sexual violence even generally. And then at the level of their well-being, many of them described developing stress symptoms that resulted in physical illness that they directly attributed to being sued, and the lack of faith that they saw in the legal system that essentially tried to punish them through these processes, significant reputational harms, loss of jobs, loss of income, and of course, you can't ignore the consequences of the financial impacts. And people told me they were worried about losing their homes, or how am I going to pay this? And when we're talking about lawyer fees, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars as a modest estimate. It's not an avenue that's available to most Canadians, I would say, to defend them in this kind of legal battle.
I want to read a quote from your book. You write, "Many of the silence breakers interviewed relied on formal avenues of reporting. This runs counter to the assumption that defamation lawsuits are typically initiated after women name and shame men on social media for some sort of personal benefit. While some of the silence breakers resorted to social media instead of making a formal report, a majority did not." So you're saying that even people who report sexual violence through official channels can still be sued. How is that?
Yeah, and It comes down to a specific part of the law, but I think that also speaks to a really common misconception. Whenever I talk about my research, people always jump to the assumption, and even myself when I began this research, that a lot of it would be social media.
Right.
Because I think that so much of the focus and concerns around false accusations come from what's being posted on social media. But my conversations with lawyers, the cases I reviewed, and the people I interviewed, I would say almost all of them attempted to make a formal report. And in some cases, there were peace bonds entered into, which would be like a restraining order. So there was some kind of recognition through the courts that there was not necessarily a finding of guilt per se, but something had happened that warranted a restraining order between the two parties. And there's still litigation being initiated in these sets of circumstances. So I think it's really critical that we reevaluate the ease in which you can initiate a defamation claim and then cause these really significant harms, as well as deterring people from making formal reporting, because there isn't anything that restricts people from initiating the claim. And even if you have a defense, and you could arguably have a defamation lawsuit be dismissed, you really also need to think about, it's not necessarily the legal victory, it's the process that is so damaging to people in terms of the finances, the consequences of being forced into this very invasive legal process that you have to disclose a lot of your personal life to the person that you reported for harming you. So it's almost like what happens in terms of the legal decisions are important and relevant, but the ability to initiate that legal action is really the harm that I'm hoping that this book can better address. And hopefully, I hope to see that formal reports are something that this province is willing to protect for future people.
So you have a chapter in this book dedicated to sexual violence on college and university campuses. What's the significant about how this issue sort of manifests on campus?
This was a really surprising finding to me. It was not something I had intended to look at when I started this research, but what I found, and this speaks to another surprising finding, was the frequency in which people were not just suing the person who made the formal report, but also people who supported the individual in making the report. And this was particularly true on campus because I spoke to a number of university professors who were sued because they received a disclosure of sexual violence, often by another faculty member, and then were themselves sued in defamation. So it was really interesting to me that how, and as a faculty member myself, we are encouraged to support survivors and people who disclose sexual violence, but a lack of recognition of the types of retaliation that these people who are providing this support could potentially face. And what was interesting as well is it wasn't just the defamation action, it was oftentimes these men accused were taking all complaint mechanisms to an attempt of an accountability, whether it's like the internal human resources policy or making a complaint at the Human Rights Office, and then would really create these really challenging institutional structures and had very profound professional consequences for many of these faculty members who really just wanted to better support their student in the reporting process. So I think it is the campus context is particularly important, especially as we're seeing more and more interest in addressing the problem on campus. How are universities better protecting their faculty members or the student body more generally from these types of retaliatory actions? So the campus piece was also a bigger piece than I was really expecting when at the outset of this research.
All right, I'm hoping you can do some definition, defining for us. There's a chapter in the book that looks at something called strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPPs, S-L-A-P-P-S. Can you tell us more about what that actually is?
Yes. So SLAPPs is it's it's been interesting to see how common that term has become used, and it likely is attributed to the province of Ontario adopting legislation to address these types of lawsuits. But essentially, at their core, they're lawsuits that are initiated with the intention of stifling public participation, broadly defined. The initial term was a very specific U.S. term that was in relation to very political speech. However, the province of Ontario and BC has adopted legislation to address these types of lawsuits that are intended to protect people from lawsuits against matters of public importance, which I think many of us would agree gendered violence is of public and political importance in this current climate. And so that's really the SLAPPs is an academic term that has been kind of adopted into policy and law more recently in those two provinces so far. Can
you give us an example of how anti-SLAPP legislation can be used in the case of defamation suits and sexual violence?
Absolutely. So the intention of the anti-SLAPP legislation is to provide defendants, so people being sued, a mechanism and, in theory, to have a lawsuit quickly and more effectively dismissed before having to go through the entire defense and discovery. So its intention was to do that. There's a lot of debate on whether that has been realized with the legislation. However, there are a number of cases in Ontario that have been, for example, I'll think of a case that somebody reported to the police, and then the person and the defendant entered into a peace bond, so similar to a restraining order, right. And then he sued her. In defamation. However, she was able to successfully bring an anti-SLAPP motion forward, and on the grounds that reporting is a matter of public interest. This type of speech needs to be protected, and it has a public interest component to it. And so the courts did dismiss the lawsuit using the new legislation, new-ish legislation has been around a while now. But with that being said, it's not always the case, and I talk about this in the book. There are instances, specifically social media disclosures, the courts have not been as willing to dismiss those types of communications.
All right, we've talked a lot about the issues, but I want to talk a little bit about potential solutions. What should be done to improve this issue?
Oh, there's a lot, but where to begin? I think beginning with, of course, addressing gendered violence more broadly, societally, is the ultimate goal. While we're working towards that goal, I think there's a few fixes, and I don't want to rely on law too heavily because it's not always the right solution to this type of problem. However, there are things that could be making things better for people who report and are then sued. So one being improvements to the current anti-SLAPP legislation in terms of how expensive it is. It's not really that timely. And that's not just in claims of gendered violence. I think it's really been criticism across the board for all types of anti-SLAPP motions in Ontario and BC where the legislation currently exists. I think expansion of the anti-SLAPP legislation to other provinces could be a step, and maybe hopefully learn from the lessons of BC and Ontario in terms of some of the flaws embedded in that legislation. And the other being, I think there just needs to be more protection of formal reports. If we as a society are going to continue to encourage people to make formal reports, I think that there needs to be more protection of formal reports at this time. So I think those are very preliminary thoughts on what possible, not solutions, but could help the problem for sure.
Fair enough. We have about 30 seconds, and I'm going to ask you a question that probably is going to go a little over 30 seconds, but I'm hoping you can give us a good answer.
I'll keep it concise.
Did you find anything in your research that makes you hopeful moving forward?
I think there's something that was really hopeful to me, and I often think of two different things. One being I spoke to a lawyer who expressed frustration at the fact that people will say the defamation lawsuit or the possibility of a defamation lawsuit is enough to keep quiet. And we can't, and especially those of us in positions of like relative social privilege, we can't trot that out as the reason not to address sexual violence in our communities. And so I often think to that, and that was a big motivator for like when I was like, should I write this book? Should I not write this book? The second being all the bystanders I talked to, all of them, despite the horrific consequences of being sued, I asked every single one of them, would you do it again? And without hesitation, yes. They felt it was their duty to continue to support people in reporting sexual violence. And despite these like really, really grave consequences, I thought that was really inspiring and something that I continue to hold with me as I continue doing this work myself.
Mandi, thank you so much. That was really, really great. A very
Thank
important
you.
conversation. Thank you so much. In this episode of Living History, contributor Warren Schlote explains how Sudbury became a desolate wasteland and talks to one of the people attempting to regreen the Nickel City.
If you were to close your eyes and picture Sudbury, Ontario, what would you see? If you were born in the 1970s or earlier, chances are you might picture a barren landscape, scenes perhaps better suited to Mars or the moon than to Northern Ontario. Sudbury did look like that for much of the 20th century after years of industries exploiting this land. But things have changed. Green is coming back to the hills, all thanks to the hard work of brilliant thinkers and everyday people alike. But there's still work to be done. In fact, in some places, industrial damage is harming marginalized people to this day. Welcome to Sudbury, Ontario. The area now called Sudbury was once a dense forest. This is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe peoples. Sudbury's name in Anishinaabemowin is Nswakamok, meaning the Three Trails. These lands are part of the 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty, which set up the reserves around Sudbury that we know today. I'll have a little bit more on that a little later in the video. The first settlers came to this area in the 1880s with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. That was the first major industry in this area, and it brought another, logging. The railway needed a lot of wood, and as a result, massive sections of forest were clear-cut. This was a time before people really thought about sustainable practices. But that wasn't the only industry the railway brought to town. While building the line in 1883, a blacksmith noticed copper ore in one of the blasted rock cuts. Of course, Indigenous peoples had known about the area's metals since time immemorial. There's evidence in northeastern Ontario of copper tools dating back thousands of years. But this discovery set off a copper mining rush among settlers. Soon, nickel would take over as the area's most prized mineral. A key part of mining is pulling the metals out of the rocks from the ground. Until the 1930s in Sudbury, one of the steps in that process was open bed roasting. They would put down a layer of logs, then the ore, and light the whole thing on fire. It was a massively damaging process, both in terms of the clear cutting required to get all of their fuel logs, but also because of the toxic fumes it created. Clouds of pollution covered the area, and they killed plant life and harmed the people around Sudbury. Through the first half of the 20th century, the hills around Sudbury became more and more barren. Technology improvements had brought down emissions quite a bit, but they were still a major problem. Then, with so many areas having been clear-cut, there was little holding the soils in place, and they began to wash away. In many places, exposed rock was all that remained. Then, emissions from the smelters caused acid rain, and it stained those rocks black. The International Nickel Company, INCO, needed to fix these problems. It was one of the few major mining companies left around here after years of mergers. Today it's a part of Vale. Its answer still stands at its Copper Cliff smelter, the Superstack. This chimney came into full operation in 1972. At that time, it was the tallest smokestack in the world. Today, it is the second tallest freestanding structure in Canada behind the CN Tower. Now, it was only a partial fix. The smelting process had gotten cleaner, but it still produced toxic gases. The Superstack simply spread those out over a wider area rather than right over Sudbury. Later improvements in recent years would bring emissions down even further, and by the 2010s, the Superstack was obsolete. But back to the emissions cuts of the early 70s. Now that the pollution output had gone down, the Sudbury area faced a new challenge. How could it reverse years of environmental damage and bring natural life back to the moonscape? In 1978, after 5 years of planning, Sudbury's Regreening Committee was born.
I'm Peter Beckett. I'm chair of the BTAC committee, which is the advisory panel on regreening for the city of Sudbury. Well, it's a mixture of local citizens from Sudbury, government, industry and academia, all working together to try and improve the image of Sudbury. It was one of the earliest ones to start to take a whole devastated landscape with the objective of beautifying the area and also improving the whole environment for the citizens of Sudbury.
Researchers found the soils were so acidic that only a few types of plants could grow. They also found high levels of metal because of all of the emissions. Regreening isn't as simple as throwing a handful of pine cones out and hoping for the best. It's a sensitive process that has to be built up in stages. Here's a basic version of what had to be done.
Well, actually, we call it the basic Sudbury recipe, and it consists of applying limestone, which helps to reduce the acidity. A little later, we will add fertilizer, just like one might be adding fertilizer to a garden. And then we add some grass seed, which gives us the initial cover. And then into that, we plant a whole host of trees and shrubs. We're now using 85 species of native trees and shrubs.
That was the regreening in theory, at least. And I should add, a large portion of this work was done by summer student workers and volunteers. But Sudbury was the first place this had ever been tried at this scale before, and it was hard to know how it would turn out. As I record this video, it's been about 45 years since regreening work began in Sudbury, and the results speak for themselves. Where I'm standing was once a barren hilltop. This dense forest on my right has had the full regreening treatment, and this land on my left has had nothing done to it at all. It's to see what nature could do on its own around other regreened areas. This place where I'm standing right now used to look like this. There's countless examples just like this all over the city. There are some areas in the city that haven't had the full regreening treatment, or any treatment at all. These are meant as sort of control sites, showing what nature can do on its own. The hill I'm standing on is a partial regreening site. According to the city's website, crews limed, seeded, and fertilized this very hill in 1997, but they never planted any trees. A little farther away, the map says this area behind me hasn't been regreened at all. It's quite a stark difference compared to the fully replanted areas of the city. The Sudbury regreening program has become a positive example on the world stage. Many countries have used these same principles to recover from their own environmental damage.
We, in fact, run tours every year for students, for scientists, for other municipalities who are interested to see what has actually happened in Sudbury so that they can take the lessons home to their own community. I have been involved, along with some other members, with trying to encourage the Russians to improve some of their smelter disturbed landscapes, as well as the Chinese. Certainly members of BTAC go around the world spreading the message about if we can do it in Sudbury, you can do it too.
Sudbury has also had support from conservationist Jane Goodall. It named a trail after her in honor of regreening. She visited the city in the summer of 2022 for an important milestone, planting the 10 millionth tree. Of course, that had to happen the one weekend I went out of town. In many ways, Sudbury's regreening program looks like a great success, but there's some problems with that statement. First, after 45 years, Beckett says regreening is only about halfway done. Second, regreening isn't so much a noun as it is a verb. It's an ongoing process that's going to be with us for quite some time. And more than that, it's about a change in mindset, about how we think about our actions now and how they'll impact the future. There are still a lot of industries working these lands. As societies around the world depend on technology more and more, mining is only going to become more important. There's a shared responsibility for every government, every company, and every person. A responsibility to remember what Sudbury once looked like and how much work it's taken to get it only halfway back to what it once was. There's another gap I'd like to mention. As I said near the start of the video, this is Anishinaabe land. Despite the trillions of dollars of resource extraction that has happened, First Nations have never really received their fair share. The Robinson-Huron Treaty was supposed to include payments in exchange for accessing the resources, but it's never lived up to that intent. In one corner of Atikameksheng Anishinaabeg territory, there's toxic tailings from an old gold mine. They've been leaching deadly chemicals into a key water source, and while there's been talk and planning of how to clean it up for years, it's still not done. This might be seen as tangential to the main regreening project, but it's still an example of industrial damage that isn't yet fixed. Despite its flaws, Sudbury's regreening story is important to share. Humans have had a major impact on the planet. Of course, not all problems can be fixed in the same way, but the Sudbury story is a reminder that people can make a difference. We have the ability to undo some of the harms we've caused, even if it does take a lot of work. Sudbury is a lesson that through innovation and perspiration, positive change can happen. Because of that, it's a part of Canada's living history.
How is it that society seems to hold two diametrically opposed stereotypes about aging at the same time? Old people are cognitively impaired and too frail to do much of anything. Or, conversely, they are the wise owls who've gained the insight of the ages. The former is probably more prevalent than the latter, but should it be? With us now to consider all of that, let's welcome, in Los Angeles, California, Daniel Levitin, the James McGill Professor Emeritus of Neuroscience and Music at McGill University and the author of Successful Aging, a Neuroscientist Explores the Power and Potential of Our Lives. In Austin, Texas, Allison Sekuler, the Sandra A. Rotman Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience at the Rotman Research Institute and President and Chief Scientist at the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education. And here in the downtown of our provincial capital, Natasha Raja. She is Professor of Psychology at Toronto Metropolitan University and Canada Research Chair in Sex, Gender, and Diversity in Brain Health, Memory, and Aging. And have we got the right three for this discussion today? Welcome, everybody. It's great to have you on TVO tonight. Daniel, to you first. When it comes to the brain and old age, the standard story is it's a story of decline. You forget things. You cognitively slow down. Is that the whole story?
Well, to begin with, slow isn't necessarily bad. We know from the work of Daniel Kahneman and others that slow, deliberate cognitions tend to be more accurate than snap judgments. Another part of the story is that older adults show increases in impulse control. So if there's a red button lying around that might launch a war, you want to have good impulse control. Older adults tend to be better at empathy and problem solving. They see the big picture faster and better. Not every older adult. These are statistical averages.
Understood. All right, Allison, what would you add to that? It sounds like the answer to the question, though, is that's not the full story. What would you add?
It's not. Yeah, I'd say it's absolutely not the full story, and there's really trade-offs. So you might get slower at some things, you might get faster at other things. You're also accumulating more and more and more knowledge throughout your lifetime, and you're better able to sort of integrate all of that together and understand how, as Daniel said, the big picture kind of fits together. So we've actually done studies in our lab where we've done experiments showing not even just, in sort of the metaphorical terms of the big picture, but in physical terms, the big picture. Sometimes older people can actually see, they don't necessarily see the fine details as well, but they can see the big picture better and they respond to that big picture faster. So it's definitely not just a story of a decline. And we also know that the older brain can rewire itself in some ways to compensate for weaknesses as we're getting older. So there's a lot of what's called plasticity in the brain. So as some parts might start to not work as well, other parts can take over. So it's not just an all or nothing headed toward decline story anymore.
And we have talked to Norman Deutsch on this program about that very subject. Natasha, let's do the deeper dive here on one of the age-old stereotypes, which is our memory definitely gets worse as we get older. True or false?
It depends, will be my answer, because memory is not this unified construct that people think of. There's many types of memory, many different types of memory systems and different brain regions that are implicated in our ability to form and do mnemonic tasks or memory tasks. So I think when people think that memory declines with age, what they're thinking about is episodic memory, a type of memory system that's dependent on the hippocampus and the frontal lobes, and our ability to recollect past experiences in rich detail. So, what did you have for breakfast yesterday or 3 days ago? Things like that. People, when they can't remember that, they're like, oh, my memory's declining. But that's not the only type of memory. Our memory for facts and knowledge actually might increase with age as we get more and more exposure in day-to-day life experiences. Our implicit memory, so our memory for learning how to, play the piano, our ability to swim, all those kinds of memories remain relatively intact in healthy aging. So it's not as though all forms of memory decline. Some types do decline, and they start to decline much earlier in midlife. So it's not an older adult only situation, and they're influenced by many factors such as stress, attention ability. So it's not necessarily a memory problem that you're seeing either.
I'm going to come back to that notion of it doesn't only happen once you become a septuagenarian or octogenarian, it actually happens earlier. But following up actually from what you just said here, and Daniel, I'll go to you on this. If you're dealing with somebody who forgets a name or can't come up with a word, which is something, utterly universal, how much should we read into that in terms of whether it's representative of an overall cognitive decline?
I think one of the things to recognize, I'm in the wonderful position of being a university professor, as you know, and so I see a new crop of 19 and 20-year-olds every year. And let me tell you, they have memory problems. They forget names. They forget where their classroom is. They lose their phones and their car keys. One of the things that is different is that if you're 20 and you lose your cell phone, the story you tell yourself is, well, I've got a lot on my plate, or I didn't get enough sleep last night, or I had too much to drink. When you're 75, the same thing happens, and the story is, oh my God, it's Alzheimer's. This is the end. Same behavior, different narrative.
So, Allison, why do we tend to be stereotyping older people when this happens and cutting a pass for younger people?
I think because, there is such fear over Alzheimer's and related dementia. So for people who don't know, Alzheimer's is just one form of dementia, it's the most common form, but there's lots of other kinds. And because everyone is so afraid of it, they are really worried as they're getting older. They know it's associated with aging. That's the biggest risk factor for dementia. And so as your memory starts to fade a little bit there, you notice it. It's the first sort of go-to is, oh no, I must be headed down that road. But there are so many different things that you can do to reduce your risk for dementia and even to improve your memory and maintain your memory and improve your cognitive function as you're getting older. So all of the same sorts of things that you can do to reduce your dementia risk are the same sorts of things that are going to keep your memory going and keep your cognitive functioning going as long as possible.
Let me read this. We're going to continue here with a quote from an article published by Harvard Medical School as it relates to what we've been discussing. And here we go. As we age, connections between distant brain areas strengthen. These changes enable the aging brain to become better at detecting relationships between diverse sources of information, capturing the big picture, and understanding the global implications of specific issues. Perhaps this is the foundation of wisdom. It is as if with age, your brain becomes better at seeing the entire forest and worse at seeing the leaves. Okay, let's look into that. Natasha, do you like that analogy?
So I do like that analogy, but I do want to give a caveat there as well. I think, when you, I'm a neuroimaging specialist, and so when you do neuroimaging studies, you do see some structural disconnections in the white matter. So it's not all connectivity remains with aging, but there is a lot of variability, individual variability. But I do agree that in the functional imaging world, what we see is with age, there's a greater generalization in the networks that are engaged to do a wide variety of different types of tasks. And so this generalization reflects both this ability, a higher efficiency to maybe process things that have similarity, but with it, there are always costs to the benefits. And so there's also the cost of perhaps not being as flexible and fluid in being able to fluctuate between tasks. So yes, you are more efficient. You might be able to see the forest for the trees, but when the trees matter, you might not be able to switch to focusing just on the trees.
Ah, interesting. Okay, Daniel, can I get you to follow up on that in terms of whether you like that analogy of the forest and the trees and whether it makes sense to you?
I think what the imaging studies show is just what we've heard, is that There is some white matter degradation. There's degradation of gray matter. White matter are the links between the computational hubs, the processing centers that are the gray matter. I think the central point here is that good decision-making results from being able to see patterns. And if nothing else, humans evolved to be great pattern detectors, great predictors of what's going to come next. And the more information you have, the more accumulated experience of things that you've seen and, experiences that you've had, the easier it is to draw connections between them. And that's what Harvard is talking about. The connections between disparate ideas become strengthened and more accessible to an older adult. I give an example of radiology. Radiology is pattern matching. If you go in for an X-ray and you are afraid that you might have a tumor, you want a 75-year-old radiologist reading the slide, not a 28-year-old. You want somebody who has seen it all and is able to quickly form an accurate judgment.
Well, can I follow up on that? Okay, 75 versus 29. What would you rather have, though? 85 or 40?
I think it depends. It really depends, Steve. So there are some people who are not doing well after 80 or 85. There are people not doing well after 60. That happens. But I look to the models. The Dalai Lama, age 88, I met him when he was 84, and he had just published his 125th book. That's a picture of us together on the wall. Jane Goodall at 89, who is still carrying a very complicated and vigorous tour schedule, trying to recruit young adults to become more concerned about climate awareness. And look at David Suzuki at 87, still hosting The Nature of Things brilliantly, which he's done since 1979.
I know you're all dying to have me ask you the question that you think I'm going to ask you, but I'm not going to ask that yet. I'm holding off on that question. We're going to get to some other things first. And maybe, you know what, Allison, maybe you want to bring your dad's example into this, maybe you don't. But what do you think your dad at 84 is better at now than he might have been at 28?
My dad is actually a lot better at interacting with human beings than he was when he was younger, because he's learned, again, it's pattern recognition. You learn what it is that's going to help you interact with people in the right way to spark conversations. He has a lot of stories. He's always been funny. I think he's just getting funnier and funnier as he's going on. So you definitely want to take his class if you have a chance to. And, I think he's also become more creative. There's some, ideas around decreased inhibition and increased creativity that are floating around these days. And it is one of the things we think happens as you get older, is that some of the inhibitory mechanisms may be declining. But we also think that's one of the reasons that you can see the bigger picture better. And we think it may also be making people more creative. So, and I just have to tell a very quick story about David Suzuki, because we had him in our lab a couple of years ago, right before pandemic. And we were doing a test with him where normally what we see is if somebody is walking and talking at the same time, their walking slows down. So we tried to do this for The Nature of Things for a special we were doing with him. And we said, okay, walk. And we saw how fast he was walking. And then we said, okay, now David, name as many animals as you can think of while you're walking. And he actually sped up. So it's definitely not the case that, aging is going to affect everybody in exactly the same way.
Well, all right, let's follow up on that with Natasha. Does the aging brain become more flexible and open to new information as it gets older, or the converse, which is what we all suspect, that it becomes more rigid and stuck in its ways? What does science tell us?
So I think individual variability is something I really want to highlight here, because there is a lot of individual variability that we need to account for, and many people maintain their cognitive function with aging. But the research that I've done suggests that there is more generalization of function. So in the sense that, the same, like I said earlier, like different tasks will engage very similar networks. Now, within that milieu, you could see that there might be some flexibility to switch and draw on different cognitive processes to attack different tasks. But when there is a requirement to make a drastic switch and to really change systems, then you do see a bit of an age-related hitch. So there is this task-related switching effect, and there are some executive functions that do tend to decline, but again, on average. So I think, there is a lot of individual differences, but in general, I think there is some flexibility, but flexibility tends to decline with aging. But we become more efficient in processing things that we have experiences with. And so this comes to emotional regulation and empathy that was already talked about. We really do improve these abilities because we've had a lot of experiences in similar situations, and we could build off those models to act in the current environment.
I'm going to indulge the three of you here. Let's go here now, because, of course, not only is the upcoming presidential race in the United States the first rematch in a century, more than a century, between a current president and an ex-president, but it's also the oldest matchup in American history. And I guess, well, we know that the polls say that the vast majority of people think Joe Biden at age 81 today is too old to serve for another term. And we know that 62% rather, people think Donald Trump, who is 77, is also too old to have another go-round. It is true that Joe Biden from time to time can look somewhat frail, although he sure didn't at the State of the Union the other night. And Donald Trump from time to time can say the most nonsensical, disgraceful things. So the question I guess I want the three of you to tackle is, how old is too old to be president of the United States? Go ahead, Allison.
So I just put my cards on the table. I'm a dual citizen, so I actually will be voting in the upcoming election. And I won't say, what way I vote, but there is no answer to that question. It really, as we've been hearing, it depends is the answer. There's so many individual differences. I would rather have, a 90-year-old, 110-year-old if it's a certain person than I would have a 45-year-old if it's somebody else. I'd rather have someone who's got experience as long as that particular person is still able to make the right kinds of decisions. And as Dan said before, sometimes being slow doesn't mean that your brain is slow. It just means that you're being thoughtful. And you've got a lot of information you're integrating. And you see this even in young kids. So young kids sometimes have different diagnoses of being slower to process information. But sometimes the people who are slowest to process information are actually the most intelligent because they've got so much information in their heads that they're trying to integrate that it takes them a while to come up with the right answer. I would rather wait and come up with the right answer than not. So in looking at how old is too old, there is no answer. And I think the other thing to point out when people say that this is the oldest race is you have to look at age relative to life expectancy.
Yeah.
So we had early on a number of presidents in their 60s. That was pretty much the end of life back then. Now our life expectancy is a lot longer. So even if someone's in their 70s or 80s, they're not actually as old in the context of society as some of our presidents have been in the past.
That's a great point. Everything is relative. Okay, Natasha, same to you. How old is too old to be president?
So like what Allison said, I think it really depends. There's a lot of individual variability. And I also think the person's disposition and their ability to rely on others and take in information from others and manage their emotions and behave not impulsively, those are factors that are just as important as how quickly you are to react to things and things that we were talking about earlier about speed and intelligence. I think it really is about, can you consider others' opinions and take that into account and build off of your own richness of experience to make decisions that are sound and considerate.
Does it seem to you that either one of these candidates can do that? No, never mind. That's a political science question. No, that's not a clinical question. Okay, Daniel, I should give you the last word on this. I don't want to assume that you're going to make it unanimous, but I got a feeling you are.
I'd rather make it anonymous than unanimous. I believe that science, Steve, I believe that science exists as a public trust, and it should be apolitical. Science just is. It should be for everyone, for people of all political beliefs. So I don't really like the question, but how old is too old? But I would say that I think I'm a dual citizen also. Many of us in the United States would like to see younger candidates. The system is sort of rigged towards incumbents. It's hard to get started when you're younger. It's hard to raise funds. And so we're stuck with what we have. And I think the advantage of younger candidates is that they they tend to look forward with a longer event horizon. They tend to have more, I would say, tend to have more creative ideas in general. But I think another important factor in this particular election is ask yourself not who the commander-in-chief is going to be, and only that question, but what kind of team are they going to assemble? If they can assemble a team, cabinet, and other advisors who are intelligent and compassionate and can solve problems and move the country in the direction you want it to move, that's the person to vote for, because we exist in a system where it's not an autocrat, it's a team.
Well, one of the more amusing things...
team builder.
Right. One of the more amusing things about this race is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is considered the youth candidate, and he's 70. So, I don't know, maybe Allison's right. We got to reevaluate everything here. Daniel Levitin, Natasha Raja, Allison Sekuler, it's really good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thank you, and as we say in Cook County, Chicago, to two of you anyway, vote early, vote often. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Here's a look at something we're working on.
Male biographers of these two sons, Winston and Franklin, have always seen the mothers through their motherhood role and nothing else. Because I've discovered that the biographers of male heroes, of the great men of history, want to just race through the early years. They want to portray their heroes as springing fully formed and ready to take charge of the world.
That's coming up on the agenda.
With thousands of in-depth interviews and discussions, The Agenda's YouTube channel delivers context for virtually any topic you're interested in. Check out our latest videos and playlists at youtube.com/theagenda. And make sure to hit the subscribe button to get notified about all our new conversations. It's all available at youtube.com/theagenda.